Hey, welcome back, guys. In this video, we're going to talk about squaring up a tree. So we talked about this tree on a Monday video here recently, and building it for a friend of ours. And so we're going to start kind of getting it going and getting it started. And what I'm going to talk about is we haven't done a video yet on how to actually find your center on your tree and kind of get everything squared up and ready to start putting in your ground seat and building up from there. A couple of things that you're going to need for this is going to be just a normal straight edge and a square. So if you just find a square, I'm sure you've got one in your shop. And then we're going to need also a set of wing dividers here. And we're going to find some center points. And then we're also I'm going to design a pattern pack for these jigs. These are some jigs that when I learned to build saddles during my apprenticeship and stuff, this is some things that he used in order to find your center on your cantle, which can be kind of difficult sometimes because your cantle is a rounded shape, and so there's not really a point on there that's guaranteed to be a specific point that you can measure from. So this allows you to find that center line on that cantle, even if it's kind of misshaped. If the tree maker didn't get it just perfect, you can still find that center line. So there's this jig, and then there's also this jig here. We'll go through those. I'll show you those. We do have a pattern pack. If you are interested in buying the shapes of these and making your own jigs in your shop, then you can certainly find that. We'll put a link down in the description. And then maybe at some point we might have an actual jig that we sell so that you don't have to worry about trying to make these. But they're pretty simple to make. I'll show you how to make those. And I'm also going to include in there the shape here for our stirrup leather block. So this particular tree here, we're going to have to put a 10 strainer in, which will be in another video. But so we're going to need to put the stirrup leather blocks in there so that we can build our ground seat up around that. And so you can also cut those out. If you'd rather do your ground seat solid and cut your stirrup slots out, that's fine. But we're going to use these plugs, and so we'll put a pattern in there for that as well so that you can cut these. But a lot of times I'll cut them tree specific, and we'll talk about that whenever I cut them. But the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and find center of our horn. That's probably the easiest thing to find. So I'm going to show you how to do that right quick. Okay, so any tree that you're working on, you're going to start here. This is where I start. It's going to be right here at the horn. Basically, what we want to do is we want to find the center of this horn, which is fairly straightforward. What we'll do is go ahead and I've already done this one. I've already made kind of my marks on here. But what we're going to do basically is just measure your horn diameter and then find center of that. And then you'll put a vertical line here, and then we'll come this way and find the center of our diameter across. The diameter should be the same both ways, but just check that just from a craftsmanship standpoint to make sure that you're pretty close. And you'll put a cross line, and then I like to drive a hole right there in the middle with just a little awl. So you can drive that with any kind of little awl just to make a hole. What that's going to do is allow you to get your wing dividers, set them in that hole, and you can adjust your side bar here to the radius of your horn. And then just track that around and make sure you're pretty close. You want that horn to look round when you're done, so we want to go ahead and make sure that we've got a good center point there. That's going to give us our center line. And like I said, what I like to do is go ahead and run a cross right there in the middle, and that way we can use that as reference whenever we're centering other things up on the saddle. Once the horn's covered, we'll have a center mark on our actual horn cover, so that'll transfer. We'll continue to maintain that. So once I've got that mark done, what I like to do is come over here. If we're doing, like I said, this is a tree here that we're going to be putting a 10 strainer in. And so on a fiberglass tree, it's already usually going to have the 10 strainer already in there, and the stirrup slots are going to already be cut through that fiberglass 10 strainer. You're going to want to make sure that they're square. So we're going to put this tree, laser on this tree to make sure that we get this other side exactly directly across so that the rider's legs are, the same on each side. One's not further back than the other. And so even on a fiberglass tree, be sure and check that with a laser. But what I'm going to do on this side, just to get us a starting point, my main focus line is going to be this back here, on how far back the stirrup leathers go. That's very easy to find based on the rear cut in the bottom of the bar. So this cut here, some trees like an Arizona bar will not have this rear cut. I prefer for them to have that. So, when you're ordering a tree, if you prefer, just be sure to order one that has the rear stirrup slot cut. And that way, those should be by the tree maker specs, they should be mirrors of each other. But we're going to ensure they are by just marking one. I usually work off the on side, and I'm finding where that cut actually is and just make a mark there. And that's going to tell us where it is on the top. And then we'll do the same back here. I'm going to look on top, make a mark. And now I've got 2 points, this top point and this bottom point. So what I'll do is when we put the laser on there, we're going to line the x-axis up here, and that way we know where it is on this side, independent of where the slot is. We'll check it to make sure it's close, but I want them directly across from each other. And then that will tell us where our stirrup plug will set. So your sweep in your stirrup leathers is going to be determined by your plug. So if you want more forward sweep, limited by your rigging type that you're going to put in, right? Because you've got to put a rigging in that's going to screw into this area of the bar pad. You've got to be sure that your pattern is something that you like. So, but the back cut is going to be fairly well straight down with just a little bit of forward kick, because I want my stirrup leathers to always set a little ahead of the rider. And so they have just a little shape. Like I said, this will be in that pattern pack, so you'll know what I'm starting out with, and then you can adjust to fit your needs. But what we'll do is we'll end up nailing that with one nail down here to put that in place, and that will just basically retain us a slot for our stirrup leathers to go at the end of the build. And so that's what we're going to work on there. But in order to get our laser across this tree properly, we've got to find the center of the cannel up here. And so in order to do that, that's where those jigs come in play. So this jig here, Jimmy Plant had made this in his shop, and I made a copy of it so that I had one. But basically, you're going to start out, we'll make one of these in this video, but this is a center line. If you work off of reference points, make everything square, you're allowed to find the actual true center of things on a saddle tree, because there really is no spot to put an actual square or a finite point to pull from. So, but basically what this is it's got cuts here where the corner of your cannel goes, and these are precisely measured here, the same on each side. So this should center itself up on the cannel, and this cannel's a little bit wide with the rawhide from my jig, so when we make the new one, we might widen that out just a little bit. It can be wider than the base of your cannel, because it can ride up the cannel if it needs to, if it's too wide. You just keep going until it's touching the sides here. And so what we did was we'll put that in there, and then we can look right across. It's hard to see in the video, but when that's in there, you can look right across here, find that center line that we're looking at on our jig, and put a mark right here at the base of your cannel, or your cannel tunnel right here. So I've got a mark there. And then for the back side, this jig, kind of the same thing. I've got two different widths here because some of my trees are wider through the cannel tunnel back here, and so we've just got an option there if we do have a wider one. But this one here kind of tapers in, so it'll fit most trees, and so basically it fits right in there. It's self-centering, so as you kind of tuck it there in the cannel tunnel, then you've got your center line right here, and we just go straight up above that on the back side of the cannel and put a mark. And that mark is the center of that cannel tunnel. So now when we go to square this up, that's where our ruler and our square comes in. So you want to be sure that your tree is on a level bench, and then we're going to put our straight edge right across the back side of the bars, and then we're going to take our square, and I like to use the long edge of the square on the straight edge. That's just going to ensure that we stay a little more true and plumb, and that's what we're looking for, is plumb here on the tree. And so what we're going to do is slide that in and slide it over left or right to where it's on our mark that we made. And then we'll take our marker and go straight up. And so that puts our line. That is the center of our cannel, left to right. And so I'll go ahead and carry that straight over the top edge of that cannel. And so now we've got a top edge mark and a bottom mark from our jig. So we've got that bottom mark, now we've got our top that we carried from the back all the way up to the top. So now you can take, I prefer to use kind of a bendy ruler, straight edge, and just line those 2 points up and run a mark. And so now we've got a center line in the middle. So now that does a couple things for us. One thing it does is when we put our 10 strainer in, most 10 strainers will have one nail hole right dead center at the top curve. We're going to be sure that that's centered on here so that our strainer is in there straight. And what we'll do is when we put the level or the laser level on here, we're going to line up with this top cannel point, which is center, and our horn point, which is center. And that'll shoot a y-axis, and then we'll have our X. That'll allow us to get our stirrup leather plugs squared off, one on each side, and then also give us any other reference marks if we want to put a mark on the back of the swell to help us line up the front end of our 10 strainer, we can do that. It just gives you, now you're going to have a center line that is dead center of this tree that you can then use as a reference or as a pull from to be able to get some other measurements that you might need, whether you're squaring up your skirts or your housings or your seat jockey, whatever you're trying to do, you at least have some points where you know things are square from the start of the build all the way to the end. So we'll get this on the level and we'll go ahead and finish up getting everything squared up. Okay, so we've gotten our tree onto our drawdown stand. I've got the laser level on, our bracket set up just like in our drawdown stand video that we were talking about where I was showing you that. I've gotten everything all squared up. We've got our vertical line here, our y-axis here on our horn as well as on our cannel point. So we just make sure that the laser is touching there as well as down center of our horn. And then I moved it forward and backward until I got the x-axis here on our mark that we made for the back of the stirrup leather plug. And so what we're going to do is I like to go ahead and draw a line and then we can kind of look and see, but this should fit right there on that line. So we're going to line everything up right there on this back line. And then, like I said, your front swoop or sweep on your stirrup leather is going to be determined by your pattern. So if you want more, you can add more, being mindful of how much room you need for your rigging. So, but I like to go ahead and draw that in just so that I don't lose it while we've got everything set up. And that way, if we need to adjust a little bit, now we'll have a line we can measure from. And so this other side should be exactly the same here based on our center point. So it should be 90 degrees, so off our center line. Now when I nail these in, I like to use these little blued shoe tacks. These are just the blued tacks here. Just something small that you can get out really easily because they're not going to stay in. We're going to need to get these out. And you need to always remember, be sure and nail low enough that when our ground seat's in, we can still get to that nail to get it plucked out of there to get those out. So I'm just going to butt that up right there on the back. Make sure it's straight on our line. And then we'll nail that in. Now we'll put our other one on this side. And they look straight where they're supposed to be, so they should be directly across from each other. The rider's going to be riding very evenly in the saddle based on his foot placement here where the stirrup leathers are going to hang. You've got a little bit of tolerance there, but I try to get it as close as possible because we are going to have some more swing in there. But now this tree is ready to start building on for the ground seat and doing that. While you have this in here, if you want to carry this line off the back side of the swell, I try to make sure that that looks straight. Sometimes on some trees it looks like it's off. So always build to where it looks square, right? You want to make sure that it looks proper. If the swell's a little different or something, you might not trust this laser line. But right here it looks pretty straight. I'm just going to put a simple line right there because that's going to get covered up once the ground seat and horn's on there anyway, but I just want a reference of where the laser was, and then I can kind of look at it and make sure it looks proper. That line's not super important other than lining up your 10 strainer and lining up your ground seat pieces. By the time everything's in, this line will disappear, so you're just going to have to go off a center from that point. But it will help you when you're doing your handhold and cutting that out and that kind of thing. Okay, so here's my actual jigs here, and you can see I've had them for many years, used them. I have a lot of these. I'll cut a lot of these out, these stirrup leather blocks, and just throw them in a little box so I've got enough for if I'm building more than one saddle. But they're pretty simple. A lot of times I will cut new ones if I'm worried about it, or if some of these start getting bad. A lot of times you'll cut through them when you're cutting your ground seat and stuff. So they are disposable. So it's a good idea to go ahead and make patterns of this stuff. Like I said, we do have a pattern pack for this. If you want these little jigs, the shapes of them and measurements and things, that is available. There's a link down in the description. But I took these old ones and I went ahead and made some updated patterns for you guys for that pattern pack. And so we're going to go ahead and cut some new ones and just kind of show you what we do there and kind of how to make these from the pattern pack so that you have them. Like I said, the only thing on the stirrup leather block, remember, you're going to need a left and a right. So you're going to have to flip that over. And like I said, just make a set every time you do a saddle. You're cutting saddle parts anyway. Cut you out some of these, and over time you'll get a little bucket of these where you always have some available if you need to use them. Now, real quick on this stirrup leather block, we'll cut it out first because it's the most simple one. This is the measurement of this. I do these 3 1/4 inches at the top, and then at the bottom, like I said, you can change this front angle of the swoop to give yourself more swing in your stirrup leathers if you want. Just got to be mindful of where your rigging's going to screw in. But at the bottom of mine, they're about the widest, about 3 3/4 inches wide at the bottom. The reason I do 3 1/4 at the top is the one thing we don't want to do is ever put a ground seat in a saddle so tight and spot on to 3 inches that if somebody's ever repairing that saddle and puts new stirrup leathers in there and they overcut them just a little bit, then you don't want it to be hard for them to get in that slot up inside the ground seat. So you want to give yourself a little bit of clearance in there, and then if you're doing say a cut and saddle or something with 2 1/2 inch stirrup leathers, you still want to use a 3 1/4 inch block, in my opinion, because somebody later on in that saddle's life may want to go with a 3 inch stirrup leather. And so that's really, really difficult to change if you only put a 2 1/2 inch block because you had originally built the saddle for 2 1/2 inch stirrup leathers. So we always do 3 1/4 at the top. It gives us a little bit of movement, and you can put 2 1/2s or 3s in there without a problem. So the one thing we want to be sure and do is when we cut these out is we want to be sure they're out of pretty good firm leather. You don't want them super flimsy, and you want to be sure that they're thick. So you want to cut them out of something pretty heavy, because your stirrup leathers, they're usually going to be really heavy because you're cutting those off the backbone. But you want to be sure that, because you're going to build your ground seat around this block when it's in the tree, and so you want to be sure you got enough thickness in that to account for the thickness of the stirrup leather. If you use too thin a leather right here, then it's going to be really tight trying to get your stirrup leathers slung up in there. And so we want to go ahead and trace this off. Like I said, this one's pretty straightforward. And then I like to punch a hole here. A number 2 hole is plenty. I just had a number 4 handy there, but you just need a hole right there where you can just stick your nail in that hole and drive it into the tree. It's not going to be in there permanently. It's just going to be in there while you're building the saddle. And so now we'll go ahead and cut another one out. Remember to flip your pattern over. You do have a left and a right of this. And so now we'll just take a number 2 hole and go ahead and punch us a hole there. Now there's no skiving or anything on these. Those are ready to go. There's no need to edge these or anything like that. The one thing I do like to do, just a little tip before you put these in, there's no reason to do it until you're actually in the middle of building the saddle and installing these for the first time, is I like to take these and give them a wipe down with some type of conditioner. You can use Duff's leather cream, Skidmore's leather cream, anything you want, even probably oil. But I like to put something on here, just a light coat on there, to help the glue, to prevent the glue from sticking as well to these. Because over the build process of the saddle or the ground seat, you're going to be putting a lot of glue in places. You don't glue on top of this, but there's glue on the pieces you're putting in there. And so I have had these stick really well inside there, and they're kind of a pain to get out of the ground seat at the end of the build before you put your stirrup leathers in. So I like to give them just a little wipe down with some type of leather conditioner, just to prevent that glue from sticking on these, and that way they'll slide out nice and easy. Once you pluck the nail out, you should be able to pull them right out of the bottom of the ground seat, and then you've got a nice opening in there for your stirrup leathers to fit. But that's the stirrup leather plugs. Like I said, pretty straightforward. No skiving, no edging, no nothing. You're ready to go on those. Over time, they will get shaped up kind of like this. And, you know, like I said, you can reuse them until you're tired of using them and make some new ones and kind of go from there. Okay, so now, gotten those done. Now we're going to go ahead and make this one. Now, this does not... The type of leather you use or the heaviness of the leather you use doesn't really affect this. I like to use something that's somewhat firm just so that it's comfortable to use. This is going to be a jig that's going to hang on your bench that you're going to use over and over and over again, so we don't want it to just wear out super easily. But it can be in the belly. It can, you know, it doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can be marred up with scars or anything else. But what we're going to do is trace this out. You know, I've made a little bit of adjustment from mine, and on this one particular tree we're talking about in this video, the cantle was a little bit wider, I guess, at the base than what I'm used to. So I went ahead and made this 4 1/8. It should not affect the centering. This should center in between the two bars, and so you can just pull that into your cantle and adjust it height-wise. If you're not touching right there, you can kind of pull up the cantle, and you'll be able to see this center itself inside that area in between the two bars. But we've got a center line here. We want to be sure and weight this down so we don't move it. So we'll put us a little weight on there. And I want to go ahead and mark my center, because we want this to be a definite line when we're done with this jig. And now I'm going to trace out the shape. And I've got my center line marked right there. So now we can take a straight edge. Go ahead and do this before you cut it out. Make sure you're very precise. Make your line. Then I like to take a heavier square, just so it's nice and stout. Put it on that line, and then take a spike awl or a scratch awl and really get a definite line down there. We don't want to ever try to guess where that center line is on this jig. Now, you could definitely do this with a swivel knife if you wanted to. I just found just burnishing that with a dull spike awl right there is plenty to hold that line center for me over time. That's what I had done with this jig years ago, and I ended up putting some black marker in there, I think, at some point, but it's pretty old and wore off. So just so that you got a definite line. And now we'll cut this out. Okay, so that's our jig for the inside of the cantle. Like I said, I wing these out just a little bit like I did on mine, just because that does give you a little bit more variation there on different trees. So you can kind of get that in there. And like I said, if the cantle is touching in here and not up in this corner right here, that's the important part, then you can ride this up the cantle, because the cantle gets wider as it goes up. You can just bring this up until it is touching in there. That'll ensure that you're center side to side, and this should be centered in between the two bars, and then you can put your mark for your center there. You can edge this if you want to. I wouldn't edge the inside here. We want that to fit up there nice and snug. We don't want it to try to, wiggle around or bend around. So that's why you want to make sure that it's a nice firm piece of leather. So we've got that one there. And now we'll get our smaller one, which is the back cantle piece. We'll come use this piece of leather right here. Now this one we're going to put a few more holes in. This one here, if you want, just like I did here, just punch a big hole just so you can hang it on your bench. So you know where it is. You can draw on it and, you know, put some notes on it if you want to or whatever. And then here we'll trace this out. Again, we'll put our mark where our center line is. And we'll run our straight edge. I like to do the same thing with a spike awl on this one. And then we can cut this guy out. All right, now we're going to punch some holes right here. So one of the holes that I like to do on this is going to be right on this end, and this end I want to do a bit of a bag punch. I'll show you why. That is for when you're doing something on a saddle and you need to, a lot of times you'll have a lineup nail back there, or if you're marking where your lineup nail for your skirts, that'll be in another video. You'll have a nail underneath the cantle tunnel. This will go around that nail. So where that nail is stuck up underneath the cantle tunnel, this will go around the nail so that you can still use your center deal as you're working on your saddle if you need to. Sometimes I'll do that for just trying to see if my skirts are actually centered and everything. I'll put that on there just to ensure that I am where I'm supposed to be. So I'll do one on each end. That's a 3/4 inch bag slot. You could do a 1 inch right there. It's not really that critical. And then we'll do a number 9 hole right here. Another one here. Now these holes are for when they're in the tree. Let me get at the tree. Sometimes when you're putting this inside your cantle tunnel, there's times, like I said, when you need to mark. You can, I don't know if you can see that there, but right here, you can then see where your center line is from the back side. If you're trying to mark underneath here for where your center nail is going to go for your skirts, you can get there and put a mark in there with that piece there. And then if I'm looking through this at skirt line, I can see through those holes to make sure that that skirt is straight. I know that's a short distance, but it really helps to have a couple holes right there. And again, on this particular pattern, there is 2 ends basically the same. The only difference is this one's wider on this side. It's wider than this one. So, because some of the trees that we use, this distance here will change sometimes. Different tree makers, different setups for horse fit, things like that. You might change this width back here. And so I want to be sure that I've got both sizes. So if this one is too loose in there, usually I can spin this one around and it'll fit in there. And so that's the only reason there's 2 different sizes on there. And they are angled, so it doesn't need to go completely all the way in there. As long as you're touching on each side, then it should self-center itself for making this line here that we talked about. But that's I'm calling that the cantle center rear jig, and this is cantle center front jig. And so, because this one here, like we talked about, this one is used right here. And so what I was saying earlier, if you need to, if your cantle's a little different, sometimes they're not perfect, maybe they're not inset just right, you can go up the cantle. If your cantle's narrower than this one and it's not touching these corners, you can go up the cantle and bring that up. A lot of times too, if it looks crooked, you can just push this over so that this piece is centered between the 2 bars. That'll give you true center of your saddle, not necessarily the cantle. That may have something to do with the cantle being just a little bit off. you know, one way or the other, and that can be from anything, not necessarily that the cannel is off, but maybe they sanded a little more on one side than the other, or maybe the rawhide's a little thicker on this side than the other, fiberglass as well. Any of that kind of stuff can change when you're talking, you know, 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch difference. So that's why we always say you want to kind of make it look square, but also be as square as you can get it. And so these jigs will help with a lot of that. All right, guys, so that's just a few of my saddle jigs. Like I said, I thought this was a good little video to put together just for the first steps. If you're starting your first saddle, or maybe you're interested in building a saddle, you want to see what is the first thing you do when you get a tree into your shop. This video shows exactly what I do when I first get one. I just got this tree yesterday. I center up and find my center on my horn, and then we got to determine the center on the cantle, both front and back, as well as the top. And that way we can find true center line of our tree. Once we find that, we can set our stirrup leather blocks in there. Now we're ready to set in a 10 strainer if we need to, or begin to build up the ground seat parts and make sure that everything's as centered as possible from the very beginning when you start your saddle. So if you've been wanting to get kind of started in saddles, or maybe doing some research, or maybe you've been building saddles and you didn't never know about these jigs, I think every saddle maker has their own way of doing it, but this is the way I was taught. These are the jigs that I use to get one started. And like I said, if you want the shapes of these, you can build these pretty easily. You can kind of see what we're doing. It's not that difficult, but if you would prefer just to buy the pattern pack and then cut these out yourself and make you some jigs to hang on your bench, you're more than welcome to do that. There is a link down in the description for that pattern pack. If you got any questions, shoot us an email. We'll be glad to help you. Pretty self-explanatory, but just get you some good reference marks that you can use. Everything will be square. You'll have some stuff to pull from where you can kind of check squareness throughout the build of the saddle. I appreciate you guys watching, and we'll see you all in the next video.